1 minute left to case build, but checking with all the open finalists. Do you guys consent to be recorded and live streamed? If you do, you can unmute and say yes or indicate in chat.
Go. Yeah, for OO, both speakers does not consent for recording and live streaming, but we're okay with like audience if there's any.
Okay, OG consent, OO does not. CGCO? CG consent, CO? Checking before I pass to the chair, does CO consent to be streamed or recorded? All right, we'll keep that in mind. I'll inform the ORCOM and we'll make the necessary changes. Thank you, and I'll pass it to the chair to conduct the round.
Hello, everyone. I'm assuming I am audible. Before we proceed, can I check if all teams are here and complete? Is OG here and complete?
Yes. Let me see. My partner is here. No, my partner's not here. Let me call him.
All right. How about opening opposition?
Opening opposition is here and complete.
All right. Closing government
Here and complete.
and closing opposition.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we're just waiting for opening government to be complete. While we're doing that, teams kindly send your speaking order in the chat. So we already have CO and OO. We're just waiting for OG and CG. Also, just want to check if all judges are here. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. Is Farzatullah here?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Josie?
Here.
All right. Nina?
Here.
And Rizadi?
Here.
Okay. All judges are here. OG, are you guys complete?
Yes, we are.
All right. Okay, so welcome to the Open Grand Final of this tournament. My name is Justin. I'll be chairing. Just a couple of reminders. The first is please time yourselves. We won't be writing or crediting anything said beyond 7 minutes and 15 seconds. So please be mindful of your time. The second is please make sure that all POIs raised are within the unprotected time. So you're not allowed to raise POIs during the first minute and after the 6th minute. And finally, please respect everyone's preferences. So POI preferences, gender pronoun preferences, and everything. Kindly make sure to follow the equity protocols for this tournament so that, so that everyone gets a wonderful time. So debating on the motion, this house prefers a world in which all emotions that humans harbor towards other humans immediately vanish upon the latter's demise. I call this house to order. Prime Minister, you may now begin.
Hello, can I check if I'm visible and audible?
Yes, to both.
Just give me like 20 seconds, please, so that I can go through my notes. Prime Minister speech. Oh, before that, please POIs, please verbalize yourself. I will probably be looking at my notes and probably won't be looking at the chat. Prime Minister speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Four things to achieve on top of my speech. First, on some setup. Second, on our substantives on the first practical argument on how we are able to optimize relationships. Second, practical on how we're able to terminate psychological torture that's probably exist on the status quo. And third, on some principles about how we remove the grief taxes, which is probably a sunk cost that already exists. Now, before moving on to any substantive arguments, I would like to clear a few things up in this debate. The nature of the vanish in this motion is not a total memory wipe. Humans will still know who the person was and their historical significance, right? However, the emotional sting of a loss of a family member or the memory of the warmth of the love is probably something that we are willing to trade off. It drops to zero on our side of the house. It is a transition from an emotional relationship to a pure, intellectual record of that person. The first thing to note here is, though, I think what does exist on our side of the house is that there are still going to be some degrees of memories. Upon a person's demise, the emotional, the things drops to zero. However, the memory remains intact. What this means is that because this is a first world motion, probably there's going to be a new moral norm. We establish a new social norm where moving on is not seen as a betrayal of love, but a biological reality. In the world, the value of a person is celebrated while they are alive. Once they die, the living are liberated from the duty of suffering that exists in the status quo. By biologically severing emotional ties upon death, we eliminate the involuntary glorification of the deceased that often prevents survivors from providing a new healthy support networks. Before moving on, I'll take a clarification. Closing.
Oh, so if people forget the negative emotions that they feel about Hitler, how do we prevent things like the Holocaust from reoccurring?
No. That's not something someone you love anyway. So that's not practical or relevant to this debate. Moving on to our first substantive then on how we have relation optimization on our side of the house. The premise here is that the persistence of romantic emotion after death creates a structural shadow that prevents the formation of healthy new support networks and corrupts the quality of future relationships. What this means is that on the status quo inside opposition, the deceased are to a certain extent it becomes a sanction. These memories, due to nostalgia, probably people will glorify them. Survivors compare new flawed human partners against a very static, perfect memory that I have of the dead person that I had in the past. Three mechanisms then on three mechanisms. First on how we erase stigma and guilt. Internally, because the vanish is biological, the survivor is freed from the guilt of betrayal internally. In our world, exclusively, we are able to start a new relationship that does it without the feeling of actively betraying my partner from the past. But also externally, society no longer imposes a mourning timeline. Since everyone knows the emotion has vanished, no one is judged for repartnering immediately. This removes the social friction that currently isolates widows and widowers, but also even if your died yesterday, because society doesn't feel that as a stigma, it's okay for you to go back to work, so on and so forth. Second mechanism on how we have more geographical and social mobility. Survivors in the status quo are often anchored to a specific home or city because it contains the emotional residue of the dead. Probably if your dad died, you probably have a moral obligation to stay at your house. You probably want to stay in the city because you have nostalgia, you have good memories of your friends and family, so on and so forth. The impact here is very simple. Twofold. First, we have individuals avoid the support gap, a period of years where they are alone and vulnerable when their loved ones died or when their parents died. The systematic issue of this gap of actually being able to work due to mourning is diminished on our side of the house. But also second, instead they transition immediately into new stable family units, maximizing lifetime happiness and economic security for both themselves and any dependent children that they have exclusively on side government. Second practical then on how we are able to terminate inherent psychological torture that exists in the status quo. The premise here is that grief is not a process of healing. Be very clear, but a state of physiological and psychological harm that provides zero utility to the object of that emotion. The status quo is where grief involves a very prolonged, involuntary flood of adrenaline and grievings. This results in a broken hearts, sleep deprivation, and weakened immune systems that probably everyone has faced throughout their lives. On our world, this vanish acts as a psychological circuit breaker. The brain shifts from an emotional bond to a semantic historical record instead. bypassing the trauma that is most likely to occur on side opposition. Two impacts. First, in the status quo, a mourning person is in a state of diminished agency. They are unable to concentrate, work, or care for others effectively. But second, we have immediate restoration exclusively on site government. By serving the emotional bond, we restore the individual to the fullest cognitive and executive function to be able to function at their maximum capacity. The impact here is twofold. First, we prevent the inherent harms. We stop the torture of longing for someone who cannot actually be able to sustain their lives. Longing is only functional if it can lead to reunion. When directed at the dead, it is a biological dead end that only produces more pain on side opposition. The outcome here is a world where the living are never sacrificed for the dead. We maximize the lifetime utility of the survivor by ensuring they spend no days in a state of involuntary psychological suffering that's inevitable on side opposition. Third, then, on our principle of how we have liberation of individual agency. The premise here is that emotional persistence is a biological sunk cost fallacy where the living sacrifice their present well-being for a deceased entity that cannot perceive or benefit from the sacrifice. Note here, panel, this principle is probably something that opposition has also have to prove, and that is how we're going to outframe a lot of what's coming from opposition. Four underlying mechanisms is that first, on the counterfactual, death acts as a psychological circuit breaker. The brain is hardwired to transition from an emotional bond to purely semantic intellectual memory. But also second, grief is characterized as a state of diminished capacity involving a lot of cognitive fatigue. This world ensures that survivors retain 100% of their executive function to the fullest capacity on side government exclusively. The social obligation to mourn disappears exclusively on our side, which means that disappears because the biological reality of emotion is just gone. But fourth thing to note here is that without the emotional grievance of a home filled with memories, survivors make purely rational decisions regarding career reallocation, financial liquidity of their assets, and repartnering. So proud to govern.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now let's call on Leader of Opposition.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Thanks. We're in a karaoke room.
Yes to both.
Amazing. Hold on, give me a second. Sorry, it's kind of late here. I'll take POS from closing. Please, Medzen, I want to hear your extension or Captain Draw. I want to engage with them. Just say it in chat. I will not engage verbally. I'll take you if I feel that I'm in a good enough spot such time. Try my speech in 3, 2, 1. To be clear, harboring doesn't mean like just because you lose the memories you harbor. The emotions you harbor towards them does not mean you lose the memories that you have. Because you can still remember the good memories and the bad memories, and you can still associate them with utilitarian metrics as well. Which means you can still remember the fact that your dad took you fishing, and you can remember that back then you remember that you were smiling, and you know this is a good emotion because right now you feel alive and you feel like smiling is good. You can probably think that it is good, but you don't assign values to it. You don't specifically feel that this is a meaningful memory to you, but you can think it is a good thing. So that means you can have the benefits of how to treat people in a nice way, avoiding bad treatments to other people as well. So these are things that we can access on our side of the house as well. But crucially, in a world where this is a norm, people wouldn't even feel the need to even wouldn't even feel the need, or at least feel that they are actually missing something. They don't feel the need to complete that something that is missing because no one else is discussing this. No one else is feeling the same thing because in the first place they don't feel it. So if OWA says, "Oh, you will not be able to comfort other people halfway across the globe," number one, you are not grieving that person. But number two, why do we even feel the need to comfort them if people don't even feel the need to be comforted in the first place? I think it's quite cool. But on CO's POI, because they say, "Oh, what about Hitler and Holocaust?" I think dying is what did I write here? Oh, I think dying can also be associated with similar relevant experience. That is, the experience to be for people alive can see that racism is bad. Things like things like history books still exist. Things like the ability for you to rationalize pain and associating with the memories that you have, and thinking that memories, imagining what it feels like to be in a higher level and higher type of scale means that you can probably prevent that from happening. You can have social movements existing in the first place. I think this is quite symmetric on either side of the house. But I want to know the principal extension that we have, and this is crucial because even if we did not the practical harms and able to win the practical harms, the principle is enough to win and win us the round because irrespective of the practical outcomes, the principle applies. We think it is immoral to use people as means to an end. And in the same way that we don't harvest people's organs to save other people, I think it is the case where I think it is immoral for you to do this. Why is that so? We think emotion is not just about grief. I think probably the pure is probably right. Often it is also things like hate. Because the way you should note this analysis is that we don't know why you hate the other person, but hate is something that is personal to you and the person between you. And therefore, the status quo is problematic because we think the point in which the person dies, people still have the hate. Often, therefore, people are not able to blame the other person, or they don't have the ability to express that hate to other people. When it's out to them specifically because they are gone from this world. Instead that they hate the people around them, they hate their kids, they hate their wives, they hate the people around them. This is why exactly when Charlie Kirk died, he's not a good person, but the harm therefore trickles down to their kids when they chat Erica Kirk and they say, "I'm happy that your husband died." They tell their Charlie Kirk's kids that I'm happy that your dad died. But it's not Charlie Kirk, it's things like Hulk Hogan, things like any politician that you hate specifically, things can happen at the same time. Maybe on a smaller scale, but it still happens. We think it's immoral because they do not consent to the harm that are directed towards them, and they suffer asymmetrically from this harm specifically. But it's also immoral to prevent people from moving on, right? Specifically because, for instance, if you feel betrayed that your daughter, who is dad's ex-fiance, is moving on and marrying someone else, you blame them. You say you betrayed your daughter and you are disappointed, all that shit. I don't know. But the way here is that each person is fundamentally different. We have zero epistemic access to people's preferences, and that's what should be left to decide. Method.
So the problem with rationality is I can rationally understand that kids in Africa are starving and don't have water and that they are dying, but that's not the tipping point for me to act. Your burden then is to explain why rationality gets people to act in the first place and galvanizes enough support such that change happens. You don't do that.
Okay, so this directly claims it all because OWA says you can also send people to war in that sense. I think the extension probably lies around the same track of this. Why is this true that you're able to rationalize pain, and what is the mobilization action here? Number one, I think pain is accessible because you can see that breaking your spine is hurtful. People can experience the fact that you went to hospital, things like breaking up also accessible as well, which means people can accessible and relate to this as well, which means you can visualize things like people like children starving in Africa is also enough to mobilize people. In that sense, when you are able to see that you're alive and people are suffering because they are still alive, life as well, i.e. children in sub-Saharan Africa starving, things like racism, misogyny, all that stuff, it is able to mobilize people. In that same sense, the mobilization happen also trickles down here, and it can be crossed up by this particular instance. But things like narratives about how life is beautiful, how things like you're supposed to be alive, and it is bad when you are not alive because you are missing out on the numerous opportunities in life, also means you're able to mobilize people. Like war being costly, things like taxpayer money not being used effectively is also a reason why people don't go to war. Things like not spending, not being able to spend together time with other people, like because they are not here anymore, means that you lose out on utilitarian value. These are things that ultimately makes people mobilize, makes people go to vote. The same reason that people don't go to vote because they are, people also vote because they are rational. They don't vote just because they are emotional. I think this is the same reason why you get mobilized people. I think in that sense, also like historically, if things are bad and if people suffer, if black people were whipped, I'm sorry, but they suffer. This is also a reason why they can give live testimonies, and these are recorded, and people can and see that when they cry, when watching the documentaries, it is also the way in which they are mobilized to action. This is the reason why specifically we are able to prevent any of the harms that opposition is trying to talk about. Let's talk about grief. Grief, I think, and people you love. Life is a bitch. It is unfair. It is fucking arbitrary because people around you are taken away in arbitrary, unexpected ways. That is to say, you are unable to say goodbye to your friends. You are unable to say goodbye to the people you love, your family, your friends. You just confronted this, right? Maybe you are at the most important moments of your life. Maybe you are on your graduation. Maybe you're at most you're about to get a promotion, all that stuff. These are things that are expected to you. But just like often people suffer in a very great way. Maybe people aren't able to suffer because people are able, some people are able to say goodbye in the hospital bed. Some people are not able to do that, which is why specifically harm is asymmetric and irreversible in nature. What it means that is that specifically, this is why some people cannot move on. Some people are stuck in the past, and crucially, some people take their lives as well because they cannot bear the fact that this person is not able to live in their life as well. This is probably a small population, but no, the ability, the fact that you kill yourself is a massive impact in and of itself because it means the other people around you are also, like losing yourself as well. It is also the case that you give yourself the ability to get a better future. What does this mean? It is torture and isolating because it is personal to you. The other people are not able to relate and understand your personal experience because they have zero epistemic access to your own, to your the memories that you share with the other person, which means you suffer in an individual way. When people comfort you, they are unable to understand you to the fullest degree. They are unable to solve the specific part that you experience. But you should also have certainty. That is to say, maybe some people are able to move on. Maybe all is right. Some people are able to value life is good, but it is also always some people on our side. All people are able to move on. All people get agency. This is good because it means and you are able to gain agency to your life in the sense that you're able to move on. You are able to get your life back together. You are able to access new relationship parasocially because you are not stuck in the past and you are not mourning for your own partner. And I think this means that even if all says, oh, like the pain is lower, it is still a pain. But even then, like things like therapy is inaccessible to poor people as well. So even then, on their side of the house, pain is certain. On our side, it is certain that you're able to solve these things, and all the principle of experience we give earlier applies here. For all of these reasons, I think you should stop, feeling all of these bad emotions.
Thanks, Deputy Prime Minister. Now let's call on Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay, just to check, am I both audible and also visible?
Now, dear debaters and judges, why are we instrumentalizing grief? Why are we talking about Hitler? And why are we talking about sending people to war? I think these are possible discussions, but come on. We need to talk about something more simpler, something more intimate towards the human dignity. Closing government is going to take the lower impact, the lower hanging fruit, but all teams have been forgetting to give the dying peace before they die, to give them solace when they overthink about about abandoning their families before they enter the afterlife. I would like to rebut OO and CO first before I move on to our case about transitioning to death has more solace. The ONCO talked about how can you have empathy and how can you protest and take action under our side when we don't put attachment or emotion under the people's demise. Three responses. Number one, if people do not, okay, trigger warning, if people do not react when someone is shot by a bullet, they most likely won't react when someone dies because people die all the time. And it gets turned into statistics because maybe for these particular individuals that they want to move underside of position that isn't as empathetic, that isn't as capable to feel all of this empathy, that isn't maybe like has the capability to suddenly move and mobilize all of that, the threshold to take actions are very, very high. They might have other priorities. Maybe you yourself are struggling. Maybe they are prioritizing their family. Maybe you need to cater to yourself first. So you won't create any more change under their side of the house if you want people donating more or if you want people to shoot less, because that's the natural self-defense of humans. If people most likely won't move under opposition, it won't move on. If people won't move under government, people won't move under opposition as well. The characterization or people they're taking here are not the most charitable. That's why you should take that away. Number two, like for the people who do want to mobilize, if you are sympathetic and want to help the minorities, if you are a minority yourself, you will still do it not because someone died, but because you're suffering now. You're experiencing police brutality now and racial profiling now. So your son is taken to Iran now. So it's not necessarily a future thing that you need to experience. Like the George Floyd thing will still happen because it's the process of racial profiling that has been built up for many, many years. And that's why the mobilization will happen under our side. Yeah.
Things like the Jim Crow laws were something that were normalized, thus everyone experiences every day, thus people just take it as normal.
Okay, I don't get the last wording though, but like I'm trying to say, if you are trying to mobilize people and they most likely won't mobilize by like children starving, they won't do the same thing under your side of the house. And third of all, if you're not a part of the calamity like war but still want to partake in it, under our side there's still more incentive. Why? Because you fear the consequence that the war or calamity or invasion will spread onto your country or something proximate to you as well. The desire to protest and disobey isn't driven by death of a person, but the possibility of death and the consequences of you might losing your lover. Death is another thing, but people would still flood protests to ICE or without deaths. So this rebuts their idea of no protesting and harmless rape because we don't support people dying from the very beginning. For the soldier scenario, like if they are that into war crimes, they're still going to do the same thing. One main argument about transitioning to death can provide more solace. I know this is a lower hanging fruit, but hear me out. OG talked about the bearers of grief. Maybe the bearers of grief is an important actor, but let's inverse that. It's a privilege to bear emotions and to live in the first place. We think the dying and those who you care about and the source of your grief should be the priority of the debate. They should have peace in their last moments to know when they leave this earth, their family would be okay. Civilization and us as a collective humanity has acknowledged that the dead and those who are close to death should be put on a pedestal. They should be the priority over all else priority in humanity. We acknowledge this through things like wills that is legally binding. We acknowledge this through granting their wishes. Yeah, CO, Brother.
So I think both OG and CG are both all cute and mushy. But for example, let's say there's a killer and they kill your mother. Are you perfectly fine with them feeling no guilt or remorse after they kill someone?
Your mother don't want you to stay stuck forever. Like you can honor is only important in so far as like I don't know, because your mother would definitely want you to move on and have a better life even though you forget them, but in a way that's what your mother might want. So if they want to have a peaceful death, we should grant that. It's important because death will consume all of us, and we are decaying as we speak. As our family surrounds us in our deathbed, they should be catered to. Whether you are dying now or dying an unexpected death, we all want people in this world, our lovers, to be okay when we leave this earth. CJ might say your family can move on, but you don't know that for sure. You over worry about abandoning them. That's why you give them gifts. That's why you do certain things like giving wills before they actually die. In your last months, when we know we are going to die, or like just at any time, we become the most selfless version of ourselves. We worry that our husbands or wives or any other lover in particular die when they die with no one to accompany them in their deathbed well, because they no longer want to marry another person. You worry your daughter will blame herself for not taking care of you during your dialysis. Their death feels heavy, where there's an ever looming demise fills them with despair. It's very unjust to let the death die twice. How do we cater to this pain under our side of the house? Two things. Number one, the vanishment of emotions that is universally acknowledged and biologically engineered provides a reassurance that once you transition, your family won't be put into an island of self-isolation and demise, where living just becomes a waiting game for you to meet in the next life. Because you know this, you know your family members won't move on, you know your lover cannot marry anyone else, you know your daughter will never forgive herself. But what gives you the comfort to die in your last moments is knowing that they will be all right. They will still go to college and they will still go to work maybe the next 2 weeks. Number two, we maximize the amount of happiness you get during your last months, weeks, and days when you feel like you're abandoning them. So even when you are hugging them in their last moments, going in our last moments, going to a roller coaster and fulfilling our death wishes, there's this suffocating feeling that kills any source of happiness in your last moments. So please, 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 let's not talk about Hitler. Let's not talk about conscripting people to war. Let's talk about the people on their hospices first. That's why you propose. Thank you.
Thanks, member of government. Now let's call on member of opposition.
Sorry, 1 second. Okay, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
All right, POIs in the chat, please. Three extensions from closing opposition. First, I'm going to actually mechanize opening opposition's claim on social movements to explain to you why emotions that follow tragedies are unique mobilizers and galvanizers of social movements without which they cannot function, thereby beating opening opposition. Second, I'm going to explain why against opening government, why the short-term harm of being able to move on is not worth the long-term cost of losing out on the happiness that can come from remembering the good memories that you might have had, and thereby weigh a trade-off to explain why we're still better off. And finally, I'm going to beat CG to explain why people who are dying actually feel worse on their side of the house. Let's first start with social movements. OO's claim is that people will protest at the point at which they feel the pain of death. But as CG and OG both point out, that people will likely protest either way against oppression at the point at which that is the rational thing to do when you're being oppressed. What opening opposition misses is the explanation and the mechanization for why rationality is an insufficient mobilizer of protest and why only strong emotions can actually achieve that. And that's the first extension I'm going to talk about. Why tragedy and death are uniquely powerful mobilizers and galvanizers of social movements. This is for two structural reasons. The first is that strong emotions about the dead mobilize people to join movements and protests. And the reason for this is that Joining a protest carries with it significant amounts of risks. The fact that you might face violence or arrest or crackdown from the state, and significant amount of fear at the point at which the people who are oppressing you have systematically convinced you that they are more powerful than you, that any attempt to rise out will be crushed and will be put down. That's the way in which, for example, during times of slavery, white people kept black people enslaved for so long by convincing them that any kind of rebellion would be futile, and that creates a massive amount of fear due to a prolonged period of indoctrination that these individuals go through, which is a significant psychological barrier we were to opt into protest movements and challenge power structures to begin with. That's the reason why you need a strong irrational emotion to counteract that fear. And that strong emotion is triggered by the death of someone you love. Think, for example, the Arab Spring, where the death of the guy in Tunisia is what actually galvanized the entire pro-democracy movement in Tunisia, which eventually became the Arab Spring. It was the death of George Floyd that galvanized black people in America to protest against police brutality that had been going on for a longest period of time. Because, and the point of this is that these strong emotions are what overcome that inherent fear that exists against rising up. But secondly, is that it also creates unity within social movements. And that's the only way that social movements can remain coordinated and sustainable over long periods of time. Because the unique value of trauma is that it creates trauma bonds. Because communities on our side of the house end up a lot more tightly knit at the point at which they have a strong shared emotion. They all feel that intense emotion that sets them apart from other people, insofar as only people within that community feel that strong shared emotion, because they're the ones who feel that intense anger and sadness about the member of their community being victimized. That's the only way in which social movements remain tightly knit. That's the way in which people consistently show up to protest at the point at which you want to support members of your community who you know are also going through those same emotions. That's the only way in which there is less fracturing of social movements, at the point at which people are more willing to compromise on things like strategy because they have that shared bond with each other. This is crucial as a means of maintaining the integrity and the unity and structures of social movements, which is the only way they succeed. The impact of this is that on our side of the house, these are fundamental for creating change. Because the prerequisite to create change is critical mass of individuals rising up, individuals who are affected by the oppression, right? Because on our side of the house, these two reasons means your protests get larger. There are more minorities or more oppressed individuals coming on the streets. That means your protests get more awareness created among moderates at the point at which there is greater media coverage of the protest because it is larger. There is greater sympathy because you can signal the scale of the event in terms of the number of people that are willing to protest, which signals the number of people that are affected by the oppression. Governments are far more willing to concede to you at the point where they get a level of disruption when more people go on strike or more people block streets, for example, as well as there's a signal in terms of the scale of the voter base they can capture by conceding to these social movements. That is the only way which you get structural legislative change on our side of the house. But the prerequisite galvanization requires people to have a strong emotion about the death of their loved ones. So that's the first extension. Before moving on, OG, any POIs?
Yeah, so CG's case relies on our analysis of people being able to move on, counterfactual being torturous, as such a prerequisite. CO's excited mobilization is symmetric because people can see George being shot, not feeling emotion for Floyd, but rage because similar people are people similar to them are being mistreated or oppressed or dying.
Okay,
So
yeah, so I don't know if you know this, but rage is an emotion which they wouldn't feel on your side of the house. They do feel on us. Okay, second extension. Let's talk about opening government. OG's case is that people can't move on. What we're going to explain is that the pain you feel after someone died is a short-term pain. And the reality is that there are alternatives to help you deal with it, right? Like therapy exists, you can talk about it. You get support by having shared trauma with other members of your family who can support you emotionally and physically. As well as you can engage in distractions. You can go to debate tournaments, you can go to work, for example. And these keep your mind occupied so that such that the harm you face is an incredibly short-term as a result and can be mitigated. The benefit, however, is that you get long-term reminiscence. So once the emotion fades and emotion becomes less intense, you can reminisce about the happy memories that you have. And the emotions are what give those memories meaning. So if your wife dies, eventually you can reminisce about, for example, your anniversaries you celebrated together or the dates you went on, for example. But the only way these have meaning is because you remember the emotions you felt while you were hanging out with her, as opposed to what you would feel on their side of the house, where the wife you hung out with on the date would be essentially a stranger. a proposition deprives people of that long-term happiness that they can feel for extended periods of time after the initial shock fades, which is a much larger, which is a much more important happiness than the sadness, because it exists for a longer period of time as a result. Finally, on closing government about solace for people dying. People feel worse on their side of the house because on our side they get solace by the fact that they know they'll be fondly remembered by the people around them. They feel like they left an impact on the world and they're going to live on in the memory of other people. That's what people take solace in, the fact that they left a legacy. On their side, people feel sad because they know they're going to be forgotten. Nobody's going to actually be happy about the fact that they lived, for example, and that means people have no meaning because they cannot live vicariously through the memories of their loved ones on their side of the house. Which means ultimately we're able to beat all three teams in this debate. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of opposition. Now let's call on government whip.
Okay, POI preference would be just unmute, but please don't badger. My preferred pronouns would be she, her. Please give me a second to rearrange my notes for a second. Okay. Yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think this means that I think this motion has a very different meaning under like CO's perspective. This is something that you harbor amongst people. So it's most often going to affect people who actually know each other and not people who live like outside of this relationship. It is most often that one, it is going to impact people who are actually close to each other because you feel this proximate tendency. You harbor that feeling through your lifelong experience. And we tell you that this is most often going to be sustained by things like grief. And it becomes harder for people to deal with and to actually constantly live with, right? But second, I'm going to answer the burden because I think the only burden thrown out by all opposition benches is like number one, how social movements will still persist in our side, but number two, how people will still actually like value like other things and all these things like that. First things, first clashes. Firstly, let's talk about let's give direct responses onto CO's cases. Firstly, CO tell you that rationality is insufficient because you pull out the same things as like war as is what like O already talked to you about. I think that firstly, laws exist. You don't need an emotional calculus to realize that one thing is incorrect and not. But also because the fact that life is still celebrated within every ounce of this debate is that you're still going to advocate for these things to happen for the very first place. You're not going to suddenly allow people to kill each other at the end of the day because this is not impactful to other people. You're still gonna value and you're still gonna value individual life. That is the most important thing that I have to frame out in this debate. But secondly, things like social movements can exist on an identity basis. Feminism exists because women need communities to persist and not because of the amount of like femicides that happen intrinsically. It's to protect women in this intrinsically at the very end of this like movement, right? That's what the movement is actually about. It is not created solely because somebody died, or it's not created because of the sole reason. You can create the social movement still exists because number one, you still have that identity and that need to protect that identity, right? You're still going to protect other women, for instance, because you still fear death. This is the problem that I see in every batch of this debate, is that they don't think that people suddenly will kill each other and all these things. Number one, you still fear death. You still fear the amount of loss that you have to get when people leave you, for instance. That stays and sticks around. But after this person dies in the afterlife, does this actually benefit? Can you claim that benefit, right? But then B, I think, yeah, then all the other benefits and harm coming from opposition benches about like, oh, then social movements will not exist is untrue. Not only because one, you still have an objective calculus like law, but I think that number two, things like war causes a lot of destruction, and so like governments still have incentive to care for this, right? But thirdly, I think we can like topple down a little bit of the opening part of this debate. I think all talks about a lot of things like there's you still feel pain, but there's still other things like resources, therefore you can move on. Number one, one, this is a really inaccessible theory because I think that grief numbs people, right? We do agree with an OG characterization that grief actually literally kills people. People die because they feel guilty. People die because there's a shift of blame. For instance, just to add this analysis, this is most often why we create narratives as human beings as to explain death because we need to have this type of validation that some external factors actually kill people. For some people, these things are inaccessible, right? You're unable to buy things like religious narratives about things like grief because, for instance, maybe you don't have that strong of a relationship with God, or maybe you feel too much of a guilt, too much of like grief within their side of the house to actually happen, to actually perceive this at the very first place. We tell you that this is different within government side because number one, we give you the sense of rationality that these people are going to like, yeah, these people are already gone. There's nothing that you can do about it. Go.
I feel like people care about things like being remembered and leaving a legacy. Wouldn't people feel worse at the point which their loved ones are going to forget all the happy things they felt about them?
Number one, human beings are literally just small specks of the universe. I don't understand why this is an important part of an argument because you're still going to be get forgotten, but at the end of the day. But second, I think we already framed for you from the very start that you can still reminisce these things, right? You can still view things like memories to because it's already installed in your very head, right? You're still able to access this at the very end, but you're not able to access the emotions that you harbor. It means that you're less actually okay. Well, okay. Second, talking about their benefits as CG then. Number one, we said tell you that your source on grief is going to like yeah be better with it. The way that people react to grief is better within our side, right? But then firstly, we also give you the very unique extension and very unique perspective that people basically have. Basically that people are like people who die actually have also another perspective. Is that number one, they feel less maybe burdened in the afterlife, for instance, or and other external sources if they actually leave because they feel as if this would not hurt anybody at the current end. For instance, patients who are actually chronically ill and need that amount of help, they won't feel guilty when they leave, and they won't feel like they're like maybe like they won't feel like their family will externalize this problem into blaming each other because they don't have that emotional calculus and they don't harbor this so much of feelings. So moving on is symmetrically better in CG because of this reasoning because you're most often going to like let go of all the emotional harboring that you already intended and invested on this person, but you still can actually reminisce towards this purpose. But second, I think a lot of tragedy is out of external control, right? So what have I gotten to you as as whip here? I think two things. We think that you can weigh the impact. Firstly, OT talks about things like survivorship bias, but I don't think they went in-depth analysis on why this is symmetrically important. We tell you that one, this is so important because people literally cannot move on to that extent, right? Life needs to be like life often needs to be rationalized. But not only that is true, but like second, we tell you that you're less likely to stop shifting the blame because you're rationalized. But thirdly, people are able to move on because they are unable to get this confrontation. The reason why grief exists within this debate is only on CG. Is that we tell you that one, people do not get direct confrontation with people with other loved ones if they die, right? People do not. Some people don't have to access the privilege of talking to their loved ones before they die. Therefore, they harbor this type of guilt within themselves. And we actually eradicate this as CG, and we tell you that this is so much better within our side because, like, if the weighing here is about like you did like numbers, then we win because like you save more people feel less guilt and all these things. But second, let's learn the impact within CO then. I think firstly, we already proved to you why law will still persist, why social movements will still exist, and that is literally the only burden that they throw out to you. The argument about like legacy is quite unimportant. People will still keep living and people will still be forgotten. You cannot control all these narratives at the same time. At the very least, CG gives you the benefit that you can eradicate things like guilt. For all those reasons, we're so proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Whip. And finally, to conclude this debate, opposition.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I'll take a POI from opening. All right. Shout out Randall and my partner, Kovindra. So wonderful. I asked him to go to this tournament while we were in Thailand. Hence the name. All right. Verbal POIs. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Closing government claims that people are just small specks in the universe, and that we are all inherently irrelevant in the grander scheme of things. The problem here is, each of us individually view ourselves as the entire universe. We overvalue the ways in which we perceive ourselves, and this overvaluation of ourselves is what gives us our dignity. We care about each other and we care about ourselves because we think we're quite important. And that's why we argue to you then, coming from closing opposition, that we ought to remember how we felt about someone, even when they die, precisely because that's what gives value to them. But more importantly, is what allows us to galvanize social movements, galvanize action in such a way that we're able to push for the most actionable things first and foremost, but also secondarily, gain inherent value at the point in which someone is able to die and move on. Up until this point, I think government in its entirety has been entirely dismissive. They first say that, you know what, maybe people are relevant, but the entire case of the fucking rest of the debate is about humans and their inherent value. So I think it's quite dismissive for GovWhip just to say that we're just small specks. If anything, we're quite important. I want to first deal with OG and by extension CG. This is where I'll take them out entirely. They say that they get to optimize relationships because they get to erase the stigma and guilt that comes from your partner's death, therefore unlocking mobility. First, just a general call out, they're pretty fucking robotic. Like, have some humanity, guys. Second thing, and this is like the actual response. First, on the geographical and social mobility, they don't explain why it's so bad to stay in a specific place anyway, so we can easily trade that off. It's perfectly fine if you stay in a place where your wife died. We don't think that's unnecessarily impactful. There's no meaningful difference if you stay where your wife died or if you move to, say, let's say, bumfuck nowhere or maybe even New York. Second, and this is to mitigate the extent of the impact that OG's harm has, and maybe even to some extent CG. Society has created multiple different accessible pathways to cope. One, you will be comforted by your family and friends and will necessarily give you the accommodations to hear you out and necessarily try to help you get through that painful point in your life. Two, access to therapy and psychiatrists exist, which means that they can also give you the ways in which you can mentally cope and the most effective ways of doing so. They've been studying this their entire life. They also take multiple exams and necessarily prove that they have the ability to do this. Medication that increases the flow of dopamine and serotonin to your brain makes you happy, even in the short term, and it can also necessarily limit the extent of effects of grief has on you. But also fourth, there are community gatherings that allow you to talk about your loss. All of this is to say that coping is entirely possible on our side, and grief won't ruin your life to the extent that OG necessarily paints it out to be, let alone torture you if you've lost someone meaningful. This also deals with CG because you as a dying person can find comfort in the fact that there are mechanisms for cope and that their family members can move on in the first place. This proves that moving on is possible, the extent of grief isn't that bad, and therefore, more importantly, dealing with CG, you can have solace to someone who's dying precisely because of the fact that you understand that there are mechanisms to allow them to move on in the first place. Even if you do feel guilt and shame, and this is the flip, we posit that this is an incredibly important mechanism, not for family members, but rather for killers. And this is the POI to the member of government. We told you that killers are quite important because if they don't feel any shame, any guilt, or any remorse, that's pretty fucking horrible. They need to feel the shame, they need to feel the guilt, and otherwise, there is little to no meaningful consequences to their actions, even if they could be punished by the justice system. Because you will never be able to find peace as the bereaved family member because the person who killed your mother or father doesn't give a fuck about the fact that they killed someone. You may move on from your mother dying, but you will never move on from the person who killed them. This flip is quite effective because it proves to you as to why these people need to feel the shame, need to feel that emotion towards a person that necessarily disappeared or unalive. This is the most important impact in this debate relative to individuals because of the severity of the impact. The severity of grieving, which is the harm on our side, is minimized by everything I discussed earlier that allows you to cope. But note that the severity of the impact on their side relative to someone being killed and that person feeling no shame is impossible to deal with because there are no structures that allow you to necessarily make them feel this pain in the first place. There's no structures that allow you to deal with that impunity in the first place, which is why this is huge relative to that. I'll take opening.
Again, so they don't have epistemic access to your lives, but also your extension of like remembering people is good is symmetric. Like my model outframes that, but why is remembering and assigning value important? So many things can make you happy at the same time in the long run.
Because that's what makes it meaningful. This is the fact that you can assign joy to it. That's what exactly gives it value when you feel emotion towards it. That's what provides utility to you in the first place. You prove that there's negative social utility when you feel pain towards them. But when you're able to inevitably move on, that's when you can assign positive social value and utility to it. And this moves on into the even if. Even if you don't buy this impact on remorse and guilt, you ought to wait on a timeline. We say that grief is often short-term and is worth it given the fondness you feel towards someone in the long term. This is Kavindra's second extension. I find immense joy when I think about the good times I had with my grandfather when he was alive. Widows and widowers feel gratified when looking back at the experiences they lived throughout with their deceased partner. The joy they feel will manifest throughout their entire life, but the grief is short term. The grief will disappear. The joy that you felt that you lived with that partner, those are only given value when you feel fondness and emotion towards those memories. Whip tries to necessarily co-opt this by saying that you can reminisce, but your reminiscing is limited to remembering those memories. If you feel no emotion towards those memories, if you don't feel joy towards those memories, there is no happiness that can manifest as a consequence of it. You cannot let them co-opt this. This is the exclusivity that exists then on closing opposition that we uniquely provide to you. Given that, then we prove to you as a consequence of the individual impact, in the long term, we are far more impactful given the severity of the benefit that exists in the long term when you're able to access that happiness that is tied inherently and intrinsically to emotion. Let's then talk about movements. We tell you that the most intense emotions are what drive the strongest actions. People are willing to burn themselves when they see injustices on the street, when someone else dies. But the problem on their side is you can probably forget about these things when the people die because the emotion disappears. They say, well, you know what? If we see suffering on the ground, we're probably going to galvanize support for them. The first mitigation we have against this is the extent of action is not as strong. When someone dies, the extent of emotion and grief you feel towards them is what gets you to act and gets you to galvanize people in such large swaths. That trauma bond that is probably going to be magnanimous on our side is what gets you to galvanize people together, and is what pushes the greatest amount of action from social movements in the first place, because you cared so much about these individuals. Comparatively on their side, if suffering, yes, it might be bad, but the response might not be as big as they claim. But also secondarily, when it comes to the death of these individuals, you forget about them. You forget about any care you had towards them. If you think about, for example, the Rwandan genocide, the fact that these people are dead means that there's no galvanizable action because there's no more suffering that's happening at that point in time. But the people who died in the Rwandan genocide still deserve action. On our side, we get to get action for those individuals because that's when you're able to unlock the remembering, but also the emotion towards those individuals who did die in the first place, which is why you have to act and necessarily give them reparations, even if it means they're already dead. This is precisely why on our side, social movements become far more effective. Whip says, well, will you really have any emotion for them if you never interacted with them? Like, for example, George Floyd, we're perfectly fine with that because we don't need the people who didn't interact with George Floyd to start the fire. The people who start the fire were the people who were the closest to George Floyd. That's how we allow the Black Lives Matter movement to explode in the first place, because the people who are closest to George is what ignited everyone else to try to galvanize support and collectivize in the first place. We win over opening opposition because we don't mechanize anything. We are the only team in this debate to engage on the individual level, and the collective movement is how we can galvanize change for larger society. For all these reasons, it's a clear closing opposition ballot.
Thanks, opposition rep. That concludes this debate. Thank you so much, everyone. So the results will be announced during the awarding ceremony. For judges, I invite you to I invite you to Delib Room 1 open. Yeah, please just go there. Thank you so much, everyone. Please cross the house as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.
Recording in progress.